Welcome to Inner and Outer Worlds.
What's up, nerds? Welcome back to Inner and Outer Worlds with Zach and Jordan. Boy, do we have a good topic for you today. Zach, why don't you tell us what we're talking about?
Free will and destiny, y'all. Destiny also known as determinism. Which one is it?
Debunked.
Debunked.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Solved. We've solved it.
Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe one, maybe the other.
Exactly. So let's just get right into the meat of it. I don't think we need to fuck around and shoot the shit too long. We're going to keep this one nice and short and hopefully get to the cool stuff pretty quickly here.
10 hours later.
10 hours later.
It'll be shorter than 4 hours.
Yeah. Thank you for those who listened to our 4-hour deep dive into
alien information
theory, cellular automata, all that stuff. Hopefully it was worth the time. We think it ties in to this stuff as well. So
it ties into determinism a lot in terms of cell updates, cellular automata.
Yeah, if you got a good intuition for cell updates, then you'll have a good intuition for determinism as well. Basically, determinism, I'll define it loosely here in the context of the cellular automata, is that the rules and the current state determine what is going to happen in the next state. And then you go on, the next state and the rules determine what happens the state after that ad infinitum into the future. The whole time evolution of the system is determined, so it is a deterministic system. We'll get into that, how that relates to free will, and
or if it completely contradicts with free will,
or if free will is a red herring that we've constructed that doesn't really matter.
Oh,
okay. Should we get into definitions and to what we think are the relevant things to talk about and get on the table?
Hell yeah.
Okay, I'll start us off. So there's a few important things. Obviously, we'll define free will in a minute here. We'll define things like determinism and then certain models that are relevant to all of this. So just loosely, free will can be thought of as us having control or agency over the events that happen in the universe or in our lives. We have free will to make one choice over another choice. Given a list of many choices, I would be said to have free will if I could freely choose among those lists and have one outcome that was caused by me. That's a big and important term, is cause and effect. So free will is intimately related to something being the cause, presumably me, and causing some effect to happen in the world. And that is kind of crapped upon by the notion of determinism, which is the notion that the state of the universe is completely determined by its past states. So in that sense, that kind of removes that our choices have any impact, because our choices are also events in the universe. So our choice was determined by previous factors. So this is where it's kind of like determinism versus free will. And this is where a lot of debate goes on and a lot of confusion also goes on.
What can those previous factors be for a human being?
Like the factors. Yeah. So you can come at this from a few different standpoints. You could come at this scientifically by talking about like neural activity, bodily processes, stuff like this.
DNA.
Yeah, genetics. You could come at it from like environmental factors. So you can start talking about objective things. You can also come at it from like a spiritual point of view or like subjective point of view, or psychic point of view, where you have all these emotions going on inside of you. You have thoughts that you don't really identify with. You have urges, you have instincts, like primal instincts. Like, for instance, if I have sexual urges and I act like in a strange way because of that, you might not identify with those choices that you made because these instincts are like overriding your cognitive, the person that you identify with, even though it's all coming from within you, supposedly. So there's all these factors that come into play into any choice or action that you make. Those are like internal, but then I did mention environmental factors, and those also deeply affect. I would say it's all intimately connected to the choices that you end up making. And what we want to believe by saying that we have free will is that despite all of that, despite all of our intrinsic emotions and feelings and thoughts and instincts
And our history.
And despite all the environmental things that are impinging on us, we still have the choice to make, we still have the freedom to make a choice despite all of that. So that's what people latch onto with free will. And we're going to debunk that tonight. Okay, so let me just define a few other terms. So libertarian free will is in line with what I was just describing. So libertarian free will is the notion that we have agency over nearly every choice or event in our life. So like I said, despite all of these external and internal variables, we still have the ability to be the prime cause of events or effects that we go through in our life. I defined determinism already. I'll just reiterate it because it's super important. So again, determinism is the notion that the state of the universe is completely determined by past states. This sort of stomps on the ability for our choices to be made by us because our choices are also determined. There's another notion called compatibilism, which the term kind of hints at what it's going to be, is that free will is compatible with a deterministic universe. Somehow that is maybe yet to be known, because it sure as hell feels like I have free will, but the more we investigate the universe, it sure as hell seems deterministic. So in the face of those two things, a compatibilist would allow for both of those to be true at the same time, and you'd sort of just be agnostic as to how that could be, or you could propose how that could be, but many people maybe don't know exactly. It seems sort of like magical how there could be free will in a deterministic universe, but you kind of leave the option open. Okay, Zach, did you have any other thing? Because the next things I want to talk about kind of jump off the deep end, so
Let's go deep, boy.
okay, you say some things. Just say what's on your mind. I've just been jabbering, so.
I guess all these three definitions have to do with the level of agency we actually have. We're trying to get to the truth here, and maybe we do, maybe we don't, with our conclusion that we've found in the last day or so researching this. But it's pretty satisfactory. It's way beyond what I thought we would get to. But yeah, in terms of the libertarian free will, which we all prefer to have, we all prefer to feel like we are free to make our own choices. That's a sense of total agency where we are free to make final decisions, and it came from us.
Yeah, and that's sort of propagated in Western culture as well, is that we are individuals. We are separate from reality. We have agency over ourselves, and we are agents within a larger system as well, particularly when you get to ethical systems and judicial systems, is that we have responsibility for our actions,
Mm-hmm.
and I should be upheld to consequences if I do something that doesn't align with societal ethics. So I can be punished accordingly because I freely decided to make decisions that caused, for instance, harm to other people or harm to the system.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into ethical notions related to free will, because I think that's the most direct implication of free will. Another very important implication of free will is that we believe that it gives us meaning in life, and we think that if we didn't have free will, we would be devoid of meaning. So we'll get into both of those, like the ethics surrounding this, and the notion of meaning and how that ties into things.
I think also what's a factor is our past ancestors who felt like they had their freedoms crushed by higher power means of control, whether that was through some sort of kingdom or some sort of slavery or some sort of war, and they had to spend an entire lifetime doing things that they didn't want to do.
Yeah, totally.
So it created this era of America, land of the free.
Yeah.
And
So
that sort of glorified freedom feeling that we have adopted through our culture, and we do not want to let go of.
that's a really interesting.
It feels like imprisonment if we let go of that.
Okay, so that's a really interesting point to bring up, actually. So that's almost like a natural development of going from like oppressed slave class type civilization, where you traditionally don't have many freedoms, and then you're offered these freedoms and this individual identity and the ability to enact yourself in an economic system, like via invisible hand, like Adam Smith type capitalist things.
That invisible hand meaning the theory that society benefits when people act in self-interest.
Exactly. So that's like the whole basis of capitalism, where now we can behave as individuals, enact our free will economically and socially, and reap the benefits of that. But I think that that's more of like a local optima of humanity, is that we've temporarily found salvation from these oppressive traditional monarchs or other systems of oppression, like dictatorships and whatnot. But that's also causing problems with, for instance, stripping us of collective identities, or removing our connection with nature, and our connection with each other. So being too individualist focused is not good, and that's kind of coming about with all these meaning crises that we're going through on an individual level, like with rates of depression and suicide and whatnot increasing. It could indeed be correlated with things like that. So it could be like a false equivocation of these causing one another, but it definitely seems like there's some clear mechanisms that could be in place where if you embrace too much of an individual identity, that it strips meaning from your life as well and causes many problems down the road.
And then also, though, if you adopt too much of a societal identity, potentially you start neglecting what it takes for your own self to survive.
Yeah, that too, for sure.
So it's a delicate balance. And I think in the end, we'll get to why, but it's very valuable to see ourselves rather than citizens of our own body, and this is what it means to be human, just what's to the boundaries of my skin.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to jump from that paradigm to the paradigm of I'm a citizen of the universe, and what's good for me is good for everybody, and what's good for everybody is good for me.
Yeah, yeah.
I think our come from energy is important, though, because what this invisible hand structure that society benefits when people act in self-interest, it sounds great, but I think when our come from energy is rooted in too much greed or too much self-pleasure, we can be like, oh, like I'm just pursuing my business goals for the better of society. But really, if you get true with yourself, you're coming from a place of greed.
Yeah, this will actually tie into the Jungian stuff we'll bring up, where this is more of like a transcendent form that is impinging on our personal volition. So like the capitalist system is sort of that like Jungian demon, which is manifesting through us and acting through us, and in an independent timeline where that more transcendent force didn't exist, we might behave in a more personally aligned way that is more in alignment with like human values or like ethics that are more charitable to other people, or more compassionate, considerate.
Yeah.
But instead we get sort of like taken over in a sense by this overarching system that sort of shapes your thoughts and behavior.
Right. And if we're starting to move from identifying as individuals to identifying as the universe, and we are intelligent beings evolving, this is essentially the process of intelligence maturing. Because we've moved from a place of slavery to now, quote unquote, freedom of individuals, where that kind of started taking over as its own entity, or demon, or daemon, as Jung calls it, where we say we're serving society and serving ourselves simultaneously, when really we're starting to slip into a come from energy of greed and competitiveness and cutthroat tactics or deception in the world of business, or and that bleeds into other relationships. So this is all because intelligence is evolving into new paradigms, and we're essentially jumping from paradigm to paradigm more and more often now,
right,
at a faster rate as we evolve collectively due to globalization and stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting.
This is cool because I didn't expect to talk about this in this podcast, but it's like,
yeah, me neither.
It makes sense in terms of what we're going to talk to with free will and determinism, because essentially intelligence is evolving in a direction where freedom isn't necessarily the most important thing, freedom of our own individual self. We're going to start speaking more in terms of freedom of us as universal intelligence rather than freedom of the individual.
Yeah.
But we'll unpack some stuff first before we get there.
Also with like the onset of AI and maybe AGI, like general intelligence of non-human intelligences, we're going to start to face that existential threat and kind of look ourselves in the mirror and ask, like, who am I really? Who are we as a society? Are we all that special? And what do we really want out of this experience? And I think we'll start to find the collective more as a country finds the collective in the face of a external country threat. We might find the collective of humanity. It's like if aliens came to Earth, it'd be like, every human is my best friend, like from any country, I don't care the race.
Yeah.
because we have an existential threat that is these aliens supposedly.
Even if the aliens were harmless, it would, at this point in our conscious evolution, it would seem like they're so foreign that they could be a threat, and it would bring us together anyways. So
right,
yes,
and I feel like the more realistic threat immediately is the AI potentially.
right.
So,
But that's good to bring that up. Like
Yeah.
when in face of danger, we come together as a collective and determine what our collective values are. But when there's no imminent threat, we tend to live these segregated lives where we don't consider the other, at least in terms of outside of our own family,
yeah,
very often, and we don't really care about their well-being as long as ourselves and maybe our immediate relatives and friends are taken care of.
Yeah.
When really we are moving into a place of consideration and love for all humanity.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into the free will, the meat of this. I did like that diversion, but okay, so to start this, let's just take a look at some of the possibilities, okay? So let's start with the deterministic universe. So, okay, it seems like if everything is determined, there's no room for free will. Okay, like things are determined from the initial state of the universe and they're proceeding according, if you're a cellular automata, according to some rules. If you're not a cellular automata and it seems like the universe is what we see it to be, it's like objects and forces and space and time and stuff, that there's just laws of physics and that's determining the next state. So either way, the next state is determined from previous states.
Even mental states.
Yeah, even mental states.
You have one thought
yeah.
about something. Let's say I'm thinking about hockey, and then I think of a hockey player, and then I think about their stats, and then because I'm thinking of stats, I think about numbers that have to do with...
Exactly, and now that's
whatever.
only the conscious stuff that you're aware of. There's all this unconscious internal things going on in your minds that then determine what bubbles up into consciousness, for example.
Yeah.
So that's determinism. What other mechanisms might be in place? Well, randomness seems to be another one. So randomness is sort of the extreme opposite of determinism, where the next event is completely not determined by the previous event. The next event is completely random. So it doesn't matter what was previous to right now, or it doesn't matter what the current state is, the next thing is random. Okay, it seems like there's randomness in nature, but there may not even actually be randomness in nature. Like, for instance, if I roll a dice, that seems like it's a random outcome, but in principle, that outcome was determined by all of the inputs to that dice roll, dependent on the gravity, the friction of the surface, the hardness and of the dice and the surface, the speed and all this stuff. So in principle, that outcome was not random from the perspective of the universe. It was determined by the universe. But to me, that's random. So we might call this like an epistemic randomness, or so epistemic meaning that my knowledge of the dice was insufficient to explain its behavior. So to me, it seems random, but in fact, its behavior was determined. So these are two sort of like opposite ideas, randomness and determinism, and randomness may not even actually exist in nature. So where does free will lie in that? Well, if free will is randomness, that doesn't really make sense, right? Because it seems like I should have a choice, and that's not random. So if we go the other way to full-on determinism, that seems to get rid of free will, right? Because my choice was determined beforehand. So free will maybe is in between those things. pure determinism and randomness. But there's not really an alternative reality that lies in between those things. It's more that either things are determined or things are random. Like, what is in between that?
I'm going to throw an idea that is not on our agenda out there based on the last episode we just talked about cellular automata and how our reality requires a perfect balance of order and chaos.
Mm-hmm.
So if randomness is complete chaos and determinism is complete order, a perfect balance of that somewhere in between could be free will, where X amount of things are determined and X amount of random factors are at play for us to be able to make a decision.
Yeah. So I would say that would be true on the level of the grid patterns, but on the level of the grid itself, the grid is determined no matter what. The grid is always determined by the previous state. The pattern itself looks a certain way and behaves a certain way, and that's, as like an observer of the pattern, we would say that the pattern's random, or in the case of a boring set of rules, the pattern is determined. And then in between that, yeah, there's complexity and it's interesting, but we're talking a layer above reality in that case. We're talking at the layer of grid patterns, not the layer of the grid. The grid itself is determined in that case. But that is an interesting thing to bring up, because is the realm that in which us humans occupy, are we in the realm of base like reality, or are we sort of like layers up from that, interacting in like a different game, you know? So in terms of free will, maybe there's no free will on the base layer because it's all determined, but the layer that we occupy, this notion of free will seems relevant and interesting, and it could be in like that complexity type domain.
So these layers that could exist below us, are you talking subatomic particles, atoms?
Yeah, exactly. Like the
Molecules,
fundamental like update states of the universe.
Right.
And those are
at
more or
some
less
level,
inaccessible to us.
Right. And at some level, a complexity manifests called free will.
Right. Or
the agents on that level have freedom to choose that agents on lower levels did not have.
yeah, so that comes into the notion of strong emergence versus weak emergence, where if what you're saying, I think it aligns with strong emergence, where we could not predict in principle from these lower levels that free will would emerge at a higher level. It's sort of like disconnected. Like free will just like snapped into existence once you had some layer of complexity. Most people in philosophy and science would disagree that strong emergence can be a thing, because it's more or less an appeal to magic.
It feels wrong.
It feels wrong. It's like, in principle, you can't explain this higher level operation from lower levels. Like if we go back to that flocking analogy of the flocking of birds from the previous episode, the flocking behavior can in principle be deduced from the lower level interactions of these birds. So we call that weak emergence, where the flocking behavior emerges, but it emerges weakly from the lower level interactions, where in principle, if you analyze the low level interactions and sort of played around with those and looked, like you could make your way up from like 1 bird to 5 birds to 10 birds to, and then eventually in principle you're being able to like predict that flocking behavior would occur, even though when you're just looking at individual bird behavior, it seems counterintuitive that flocking behavior might occur. But in principle, you can work your way up from the low level to the high level. But if you're appealing that free will just like sort of magically occurs once you get some level of complexity, like a human brain. That's sort of like an appeal to magic almost, where it doesn't really seem like it's possible to go from deterministic subatomic particles to deterministic atoms to deterministic molecules, and all of a sudden you just have non-deterministic
Free will.
So that's where things get a bit iffy.
It's also funny because for the same reasoning, most of scientists out there think that consciousness just arises in the same manner.
That's the thing.
Which is ridiculous. It's not just a magical thing that just spontaneously comes out of nowhere at a certain level of existence.
Yeah, I agree. I think
what makes more sense is that is foundational and everything else is built from that.
Yeah, or at least everything else is on par. Like everything else is made from like the same stuff, so to speak, as my subjective experience.
Right.
Like the notion of like colors and sounds and smells and whatnot, like these are not just illusions or just complex patterns of interacting particles. Like these are fundamentally real things, and the sort quote unquote inanimate like matter that I see out there also possesses qualitative behaviors as well, or qualitative properties. So
whether it's free will or consciousness arising out of nowhere, it seems silly and too fantastical to be how the nature of reality is.
Right.
So bringing it back to free will, okay, if it doesn't just magically arise out of anything in particular, and it doesn't seem like our cells are just free to do whatever the fuck that they want, and our atoms aren't just free to do whatever the fuck that they want. So what seems to be more accurate is that because our cells are determined to behave in a certain way and stay within the confines of our skin and our body vibrating in a certain way together to maintain the shape of our organs and our bodies, then maybe it's not so far-fetched to say that everything that we do on a level up from that is predetermined as well. Or not predetermined, but determined.
Yeah,
as well.
Determined from a very complex arrangement of things, of processes going on, and dictating the next state, determining the next state, and then we're kind of on the top of that chain observing things from above.
Right.
So here's where we'll start to like really rip through this. So I'm going to bring back to what I was talking about before we went on this tangent of the only options that really seem plausible are determinism, where everything is determined, and pure randomness. And I already said that it doesn't seem like free will is commensurate with randomness, because if I'm making a choice, it doesn't feel random. But then when I'm making a choice, it doesn't feel determined by something else. So the key thing is that the choice should be determined by me. So with free will, it's not that the choice was random or that the choice was determined by like some Martian on Mars or something. The choice for me to identify with free will is that if that choice can be said to be made by me, then I acted according to free will. Okay, so this is the key thing, is that free will seems to come down to a matter of identification. And it's identifying with a determined event, where the event was determined, but I am the one that was determining it. So if we start to like look into what am I and how am I making these decisions? What do I have access to? The more you kind of start looking at it, the more you realize there's not actually that much that we have control over, that we have full control over, at least from our point of view. For instance, our emotions aren't chosen by us. I think we can maybe reflect on the emotions we have and sort of introduce some sway to those and try to evaluate them, but the emotions that come up are not chosen by me. They just come up in me.
Otherwise, you'd just be happy all the time.
Right. So I would just choose to be happy if I had free will over my emotions. I don't choose to get angry, or I don't choose to feel like sad, or to feel horny, or to feel I already said angry. All the plethora of emotions, they just come to me. Like I feel them and then I identify with them. The same, which may not be intuitive at first, is the same can be said for thoughts. Is that, okay, if you just like let your brain sit, or even if you're trying to generate a thought, you don't choose what thought comes into your brain next. The thoughts sort of just happen. Like,
you kind of wait for it.
You kind of just wait for the thought, and then typically we identify with a thought and we say, oh, I generated that thought. But if you kind of pull back from that in like a meditative sense, these thoughts sort of just like bubble out of nowhere, pass through your mind. And you can kind of just like look at them and wave and be like, oh, that's a thought I just had. And then it goes away. And then another thought comes, and that can go on and on.
Even we were briefly before this episode started talking about looking at options on a menu. You can see several different options, and each of those options is like new extrinsic data coming into your system.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start a series of computations basically within your brain that starts weighing the options, and you see maybe chicken on the menu and it looks good, but you just had chicken yesterday, so you're kind of leaning in a different direction. You want something different.
You just watched a documentary with chickens getting killed, and like,
and you're a little turned off.
Yeah,
from
you're
that.
like, oh,
maybe you're turned off from all animals for a little bit, or maybe forever if you
hadn't powerful enough reflection on some external data, or maybe you had some internal thoughts that you sort of just arrived on your own. But did you formulate those thoughts, or did those thoughts just sort of bubble up into your brain?
Right.
So
because we can't just know what we're going to be thinking 5 minutes from now, the exact thought that we'll be thinking in 5 minutes, these thoughts seem to just come up and arise out of nowhere, and typically they're stimulated. The things that come up internally are stimulated by some sort of extrinsic data.
Yeah, or by some internally processed symbols that you've maybe trained up over time, and that your
those
unconscious
neurons are firing together.
Right, and your unconscious brain was sort of chewing on it for a bit, and then it like bubbled up into your conscious mind.
Yeah, so even in those situations, when we think we're choosing an item on the menu, with free will, it's actually more based on previous states that we've experienced that are now in the present moment arising deterministically into a final, what feels like decision.
Yeah. But let me define a very crucial term.
Okay.
Because right now it sounds like we're saying that everything's determined, free will doesn't exist. And while we're kind of saying that, let me define some important things that will help us get out of this seemingly bleak conclusion. And that's the notion of computational irreducibility. That's a lot of syllables, And that sounds very confusing, but it's quite a simple concept in that it is impossible, even in principle, to predict the future states of the universe from the current state. So we could say that the future states are not reducible into the current state. So even though the universe is deterministic, even though the next state is purely determined by what the current state is, and the state after that is determined by the next state, and so on and so on, I can't cheat and I can't jump ahead 10 states in the future, because for me to calculate or simulate what would happen 10 or 100 steps, or that's sort of cellular automata speak, but let's say for me to
100 years from now, let's say this,
not even 100 years,
100
like 100
days.
seconds from now, to simulate the universe like on a universal like level, like where I'm simulating quantum particles, and or even like if we're on the level of our brain, which is supposedly responsible for free will, for me to predict the future states of your brain to an adequate level that would explain like your decision process, to get a sufficiently good prediction into the future would take so much computing power right now that it's infeasible to simulate any of that now and get an answer by the time we get to that state. So I can't reduce the future state to the current state. The universe is computationally irreducible. So this is important because, yeah, despite being determined, the universe needs to play itself out to know what will happen. So like I said, we can't jump ahead and know what will happen. The fastest processor of what will happen is the universe itself.
So I'm going to jump in and try and simplify. When a program reaches a certain level of complexity, it's no longer faster to simulate the program and see what the end result will be. The fastest way to get to the end result is to let the program run and unfold.
Yeah.
And that is the fastest way to see what the program will end in, rather than coming up with a simulation of, let's say the program is our universe, and we try and compute with computers the final outcome of everything in the universe, all the quantum particles, all everything, all the brain states, what just the final ending of what everything's going to be. I know they say it's going to implode on itself and blah, 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 and maybe that's what will happen cosmically, but in terms of human beings and how long we'll live and blah, 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 every detail, it's too many moving factors for us to be able to simulate this. It's too complex. So the fastest way to get to the end, because there's so many moving parts, is to allow the process to unfold, to allow the program of whatever this is to unfold. And that's the only way that we could truly ever know.
Yeah. So it's kind of the same with like the cellular automata. So last episode, Zach and I gave you guys the rules, and then you can initialize some initial state. But if you're trying to predict the next state yourself in real time, it's going to take you forever. Like, let's say you have a piece of graph paper in front of you, and you're drawing out by hand the next state, and then if you flip to the next page and you have to update all the rules by hand, that's going to take you forever. You just let the program run, and that's the fastest way to observe the next state. Same with our universe. Like, our universe, even though it's most likely determined, it doesn't know what the next state will be like 10 steps ago. It has to go through the motions in order to know what's going to happen next. So how this relates to free will is that even though our choices may be determined in advance, we still have to act them out. We still have to participate in the universe doing its thing. We have to identify with this choice because we don't know. And not only do we not know, but most likely for instance, the God that pressed run on this universe, the God also doesn't know. The God wouldn't just let this thing run if he knew all the intermediate steps, right? So you have to let the thing run to know what's going to happen. It's irreducible not only to the observers within the universe, but to an external observer as well. The God can't just simulate intermediate steps 100 years in advance, 2,000 years in advance. The fastest way for God to know what's going to happen next is to watch it unfold in real time. And the cool thing for us is that as an agent in this universe, we're at the forefront of that computation. So not only do we not, we're at the bleeding or leading edge, as Zach and I debated. We actually reached a conclusion. Those are both equally usable. Bleeding edge or leading edge. Either way, as an observer in this universe, we are at the bleeding edge of what is happening right now. So not even us nor the God that created this universe knows what's going to happen next or into the future. So in that sense, we are that's more or less like a freedom with that. And if we identify particularly with our actions, or if we identify with that process of universal unfolding of events, then that's us acting according to the will of nature. And because what we identify with, if we identify with what is determining the following events, like I said, that's the definition of free will, right? If you identify with what is determining the future events, so if what determines the future events is you, then that is said to be free will.
Say that again.
So going back to, we were discussing if free will is more related to randomness or determinism. We said that free will is the notion that the next events were determined by me. So it's a matter of identification. Where do I identify me? If I identify me as the ego, which just gets thoughts bubbled up to it and emotions bubbled up to it, I don't have much room for free will because the ego is not determining much. The ego doesn't have much freedom of its will because emotions are determining actions, instincts are determining actions, all sorts of things are determining actions. But if I identify myself with this universal unfolding of events, then I have free will, and that's in alignment with you could call it God, or you could call it cosmic consciousness, or you could call it like universal meaning and so on.
I just wrote down earlier too, your ego's free will is not the same as universal free will. Ego often wishes there were, or that things were better or different, but that's a waste of time. It's like swimming upstream. When we can align with universal free will, that's when life becomes easy, and it'll feel like we're swimming downstream, going with the flow of life. And that's when life can bring us some of the things our egos desired, but also other things that are just naturally meant for us through the unfolding of the universal program.
Right. Yeah, because if you trap yourself in your ego and you inevitably have these unconscious processes happening to you, you have your instincts. So this is where we get into the Jungian ideas that I briefly mentioned earlier. So within the unconscious are sort of two extremes. One is the instinctual side of us, like these emotions, these animalistic behaviors, like sexual libido, and like basically the instinct to survive. So procreate and eat food and maintain homeostasis. Like, these are instinctual things that our bodies go through. And most, if not all, animals are kind of stuck to this level. The next level is where you get into consciousness and you get cognitive agents that at the very least have the notion of having personal volition or free will. And that's typically where we identify ourselves. But there's still this instinctual side of us as well that's sort of happening foundationally and underneath in this unconscious. There's also another side on the other extreme, which is also unconscious, which is sort of like transcendent of the ego. It's the it's sort of called the spiritual form, where you have, like we mentioned, capitalism, that is a transcendent super ego of us that manifests through our body and causes us to behave in certain ways. So it's something beyond our individual identity. You could call like religion something like this as well. Or like, for instance, monks take this to the extreme where they're identifying not with their personal volition or the instinctual volition. They deny all of that, and they've transcended to this more or less spiritual form where they're behaving according to like some sort of cosmic will or some universal truth that's transcendent of their what would typically be like an ego. Where was I with this?
So what are we identifying with is what it comes down to.
Right.
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. So we typically identify with what seems to make us human, which is that intermediate conscious layer, which is sort of sandwiched. Like, you can think of it as like a superiority hierarchy where it's sandwiched above instincts, which instincts are like the most inferior on the...
Instincts are the base bread layer.
Yeah, instincts are the base bread layer. Our conscious ego and free will and volition are the middle layer. And then above that is another unconscious layer that's somewhat superior to us, where it's sort of transcendent.
The top piece of bread.
That's the spiritual form that can manifest through us. That's the Jungian daemon, which sort of has its own volition that can be said to kind of have its... Yeah, so it acts according to its own will that we don't identify with. At the end of the day, though, all of these layers are not only within us, but they are the product of nature doing its own thing. So we can sort of bypass the conflict here, and we can go a level, like we can metacognize, and we can identify ourselves with all of those things. And if we identify with all those things, which are determining our actions, then, as previously I'd said, if you are identified with what is doing the determining, then you are having free will. So if you identify with all of those causal forces in you, then you truly have free will. A layer beyond that, so this is still intrapersonal, this is my psyche, this is in my head, but in reality, the separation between me and nature and other individuals is all sort of like a construct. Like nature, everything is part of nature. So if I identify beyond that with all of nature, then I'm behaving according to the ultimate determining cause. Everything is determined by me, and therefore I'm in full accordance with universal free will in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
This might take a bit of real deep thinking, because this is quite a tricky thing to kind of separate. I think we're so used to being in the ego and thinking that our ego has free will, because it definitely seems like that's the case. But that more or less is a byproduct of this computational irreducibility, where I didn't know what decision I was going to make next, and nobody else knows, and the universe itself doesn't know what decision I was going to make next. Therefore, it seems like what decision was made by me within my brain.
I think we can either approach it from this requires more deep thinking, or we can approach it from maybe the answer is more simple than we think. Arthur Schopenhauer is a German philosopher, and he was the one that influenced a guy that we're going to talk about, Bernardo Kastrup, the most, in the sense that, like, the desire that we have as human beings is equal to our necessity of what we need as human beings. Or on a meta level of the universe, the desire of the universe is equal to what the universe needs.
Mm-hmm. And you could say that instead of using the word desire, replace desire with the will, and replace the necessity with determinism. And now
so free will is equal to determinism.
Yeah. So the universe necessarily does what it does. And you could also say that the universe desires to do what it does. See, the universe wills itself necessarily into the future. The universe's will determines what the universe does. So will and desire, and then determine, and what was the other word? Necessity. So these things are all intimately connected, and in fact one and the same in this philosophy. So ultimately, the free will and this deterministic evolution of the universe are in fact one and the same. The universe is willing itself deterministically through its states, and us as observers in this ride are on the forefront of that. We are allowing for this evolution to be processed and to be carried out. And instead of determinism stripping us of meaning, because it, again, determinism and our traditional notion of free will are at odds, what really is the case is that this determinism is, in fact, the ultimate meaning. We're at the forefront of the universe, exploring itself through these updating of its states, and without us, if you pull us away, the universe isn't experiencing anything. And for the universe to not have any introspection on what's going on, there's no point to carrying out the simulation. Or simulation, like, I mean, the
program,
whatever you want to call it,
the reality.
The reality, exactly. There's no point to going through the reality if there's no self-reflective component to it.
And that brings it back to what I was saying earlier about intelligence evolving. There needs to be an intelligent agent within the reality, going through the evolution alongside of the environment, in order for the environment to be meaningful or worth creating.
Right.
So I think the next direction we can start taking with this is, unless you have something else to say about what we were just saying here.
What direction do you want to go?
Talking about different people in the media and their outlook on free will and relating that to everything that we just talked about. And the last person we'll bring up is Carl Jung, and how the Jungian philosophy relates to integrity
Okay.
and becoming an integrated being.
Okay. Why don't you start off?
So I'll kick us off by saying, well, first I'll sum up what we just said. Basically, if we're identifying ourselves with being human only and individual human beings, then it seems like free will and determinism contradict one another. It seems like they're opposites. It doesn't seem like they can coexist. But when we zoom out to a meta level where we are now identifying with the universe at large, it's clear that free will and determinism are not contradicting one another, because desire is equal to necessity. Desire being free will of nature or of the universe is equal to what the universe needs or what's determined by the universe. So if I need to drink water to keep surviving, for example, it's determined already because of the laws of biology and the universe and physics that I will receive an impulse that tells me I need to drink water now to keep surviving.
Mm-hmm.
So my desire to keep living becomes one with my biological determinism that I will receive an impulse to go get some water.
Nice. That's a good example. And then you further identify with that entity that is doing that determination.
Right. Whereas if I'm identifying with myself as an individual or ego, I might want
to continue playing video games.
Continue playing video games and pleasure seeking, and I want all the water in the world, not just what is going to quench my thirst, and just more and more and more, and what I have is never enough, and I need to succeed and be better than the next guy, and all these egoic desires that aren't part of nature.
And furthermore, you can't.
They are part of nature, but they're not.
They're not the determining factors in the outcome of your life.
Yes.
So, like, I'm at the end of the day not choosing my emotional state or the thoughts that come into my head, or who I fall in love with, or what I find interesting in life, or the friends that stimulate my mind. Like, I'm not choosing any of that on like an agent point of view. Like, I can't really exude my personal volition out into the world and get these things. It's sort of like all the inputs coming into my experience from the outside, and all of the things currently inside of me, and all of the past experiences I've ever gone through. All of that is sort of culminating in what is dictating my future path. But I identify with it, and I don't know what's going to come next because it's irreducible. Nobody knows what's going to come next. So if I'm identifying with this unknowable process, that's me having free will.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the key conclusion here is that free will, as traditionally defined, is sort of like an ill-posed concept. It's sort of leading us in the wrong direction. We have to really think about what it means and think if it's even a relevant question in the first place, and sort of go beyond that. And it seems like, ooh, I'm choosing to do this. But again, we had all these external inputs put on us, and then our internal minds are processing all of this and making this decision to interpret things this way. So for us to make this conclusion, it seems like a choice, but this is
just
the universe doing
the
this.
result of a sequence of a bunch of determined things that happened in the past, and now we've reached a part of the determinism that is reaching a resolve, that when we identify as the universe at large, we are simultaneously feeling like we are choosing everything while also being the result of everything that's gone before us.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. The coolest thing that I've taken out of this is that in a computationally irreducible universe where not even the creator knows what's going to happen next, I'm like the first one that gets to see the screening of the movie.
The star of the show.
Maybe I'm not the star of the show.
Of your show,
but
maybe.
Yeah,
we're all
that's
the star of the
true.
show. Every intelligence is the star of the show.
Yeah. So I'm in my head, I'm thinking of this as like I'm the lone person in the movie theater audience watching this movie unfold that no one's seen before from my point of view.
Right.
And that's beautiful. That's so meaningful. I'm doing this I'm the only one that can get this exact experience out of the universe, and no experience like mine has ever happened before,
or ever will
happen again. And I, as an agent with free will, under the previous things that we've discussed, I can influence other people's experiences, and I can be the external input to other people's experiences. For instance, I've had very important mentor figures in my life, or I've heard quotes from people that stimulated my brain to behave in certain ways, and that changed the shape of my life and my path into the future. And if those people didn't exist, then I would have been on a completely different path. So even if we don't have this egoic free will, we still have a role to play. We still have the ability to be inputs to other people's minds and influence the path that they go through in their life. And it seems like at least you can make that a positive thing, and influence people in good ways and do good for the world. And then you get to observe it firsthand, and no one else has seen this before. So this is super cool to really internalize.
Mm-hmm. And Alan Watts often talks about how life is like a movie and we're all actors in the show, and it's always more entertaining when the movie is a surprise if you've never seen it before. And he uses the example of dreams, and if you could dream to have anything that you wanted at any time, he's talking
Yeah, I know
if you're an almighty creator or an almighty God about to create a universe, and you created a bunch of beings that could have anything they wanted at any time, and they were almighty gods. They had every desire that they could ever want in their dreams, and they got to fly, and they got to do this and that and do it with whoever they wanted to. Eventually, the fun of that would no longer be sustainable. It would be, okay, yeah, I'm just going to do this again. And all these amazing things that you could ever possibly do would be done. And even if you did them all a dozen times, 100 times, 1,000 times, it would get old.
Mm-hmm.
So the next best way to have a fun experience would then be to introduce the element of surprise.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know when I'm going to experience these pleasures. I don't know how much struggle I'm going to have to go through to get to the next pleasure.
Yeah, this comes back to the whole complexity argument, is that if your life is too simple and predictable, it's boring. If it's too chaotic, that's also not good. So you want some complex interplay of the two.
Yeah, some balance.
Some balance, yeah.
So that's what seems to be the universal will, is what he's getting at.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Like,
and
I don't want to discredit God or the universal consciousness or source energy or whatever you want to call it, or the oneness consciousness that we all likely come from, because the universe it created is vast and incredible and breathtaking. But also, like, if it's really omnipotent and omnipresent and all-powerful, you would think it could just create a reality where everything was hunky-dory all the time and we all just lived in heaven and it was all good and whatever. But that would honestly get old. So it gave the gift of surprise to us,
uncertainty,
essentially, and to itself, that it doesn't
even
know
what's gonna
wants to
happen
happen next, because the most interesting way to watch a movie is to watch it for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's doing that 8 billion times over through every
Can we
human
all
being.
just pause for a sec and, like, do you ever do this? Like, so the more I abstractly think about, like, reality and, like, really trippy stuff, it sort of becomes, like, disconnected from me, where I'm like, this trippy reality is occurring in this abstract space in my head. But, oh, really, I'm, like, sitting in, like, a fully understood reality. Like, this all makes sense. It's like, no, wait a minute. I'm currently on a floating rock in space, getting pulled by this ginormous ball of fusion plasma that is expanding in every direction away from other universes, or other galaxies.
And there's trillions of other galaxies and planets.
And I'm having an experience right now, and I didn't choose to be born, but I'm here. There was bajillion other sperms that could have made it to the egg. If they made it to the egg, would I still be having an experience? I don't know. Like, it's just like taking a second to just get out of the abstract and just fall into that full realization of, boom, I'm here. Like, holy fucking shit, this is happening. It's like that like gives you so much meaning. Like, if you can just do that like once a week, just do you identify with this?
Bro, I do this literally more often times than I pay attention to the present moment. That is my normal state. I'm fucking not normal. Like,
yeah, no, I'm also the same.
I'm so distracted by this deep thinking on a daily basis that it fucks up my life.
Me too,
in
bro.
certain ways.
I'm so dysfunctional.
That's why we're
I'm
able
like,
to
I have to
go off on these podcasts.
I have to do like a project for this like school thing, and it's like, wait a second, I'm on a floating rock in space, like
catapulted.
Yeah,
at all these fucking thousands of kilometers through space.
Yeah, it's like, holy, like it's so dysfunctional to be in that state all the time, but it's also the coolest state.
It
possible.
adds so much appreciation to everything that's going on. And then when you are able to bring it back to the present, though, like when I was driving here, for example, today, I was telling you in the car, I had the music off, which I normally don't do. And just like watching the raindrops drizzle on my windshield and hearing the sound of the tunnel when I would go through a tunnel, and then the tunnel would go to another part of the tunnel where it was slits in the roof, and it would just sound like and then I would leave the slits of the tunnel into just open blue sky again, and the wind would just be like calm, and it was just like, when you can reach that level of appreciation for all the factors going on for us to have this experience, and then you can bring it to the present moment and be present with your senses,
Mm-hmm.
it's the coolest fucking shit you will ever experience.
Like, I mean this in the least judgmental way. Like, and I'm not claiming any superiority when I say this, because I completely fall into human games. So what I'm going to say is that us humans, we create games, we create realities which are not reality. Like, for instance, we create economies, we create capitalist systems, we create language, we create gender roles, we create family roles, we create sporting games, we create video games. All of these are human constructs that we've created and we participate in and we identify with as reality. You're born, you are raised until 5, you go to school until 17 for lots of people, until like 22 for college people. You get a job, you like participate in the world, in the reality, but that's
in the games.
In the game, that's the thing, is that these were human games. There's nothing like I shouldn't say there's nothing real about it, because it is reality. It's reality, like, manifesting through collective actions, and like it makes sense that we need structure to societies to maintain civilization, to provide us with food, like via supply chains, and to provide education, and all of this is internally consistent, but it's all at the same time disguising true reality from ourselves, even though we're smack dab in the middle of true reality at all times. It's just that our brain is operating on a different level, on a level of these games that we've created. And when I don't mean to like judge anyone at all that partakes in these games, because that's the way that our society is constructed. But once I personally have identified that I'm in a game constructed by other humans, and that there's a way cooler, to me, universal game out there, which is in some level like seeking the truth of our reality. I've done this by seeking knowledge of science and physics, and Zach has done this by seeking his spiritual knowledge. I just think it's like so much more fascinating to be part of the more fundamental reality, like the game that reality's given us, and we sort of distract ourselves away from it, even thinking about that on a day-to-day basis. I guess that's what this podcast is for, is to like kick people out of that like somewhat trance that you go through in your normal life. And I'm not saying to become like us, where it's dysfunctional to be thinking about this all the time, because I'll just speak for myself. I'm progressing pretty slowly through my PhD, whereas I should be more focused in it and spending more time thinking about those sub problems or sub games that I should be solving. But I'm so entranced by this bigger game that it's like dysfunctional on a practical level. Anyways.
I'm glad that you said that. Because at the end of the day, it is all games. All of these constructs that we live through, like Jordan said, whether that's a construct of school or a construct of work or a construct of creating a family or a construct of being part of a sports team, all of those are valuable. The school gives knowledge. The work gives hopefully some level of productivity and fulfillment. Stability. Same with the family, gives a element of stability and safety and sanity and meaning and connectivity and love. And the sporting gives us communication and physical activity and exercise, all valuable things.
And I participate in all of those
Yes.
with deep meaning. So like those are all so meaningful.
Absolutely.
But then there's another layer, which is...
But then there's truth.
I'd say the base layer, which is the truth. Yeah.
And truth is mostly unrelated to those games.
those
but
have
also
internal.
also very much connected to. You can't disassociate truth.
Yeah, those have internally.
I'm just thinking out loud
consistent-
here, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, I think you're sort of saying there's like a cosmic truth or something.
there's a cosmic
Whereas these
truth
are
or
like internal-
a cosmic game to be played, which is uncovering the truth of reality.
Right. Like these are consistent truths within the systems that we participate in as humans. Like these are things that are our reality, and therefore they're true in that sense because they are important, they give me meaning, they're
layers
real,
to the game.
yeah, exactly. So
to the
there's truths
overall
at
game.
different layers.
Yeah.
But then again, I guess the base like layers are where we find the most interest, I guess.
Yeah. Again, both science and spirituality are methods, and there's many sub-methods within each, but they're both the main methods that human beings use to discover what our reality is, and what it's made of, what its nature is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're somewhat getting at with this episode, that we need to zoom out from our narrow-minded identification with self as a human being and identify more with self as universal consciousness that we're all part of.
Yeah.
And when we do that more, we will naturally be more considerate, naturally be more compassionate, naturally be more loving.
And more free, I think.
And more free.
Yeah.
That's right. Because at the end of the day, we all do want to be free. We don't want just a purely deterministic reality.
That's the key thing, is we're free on the forefront of reality developing itself.
Yes.
Like we are the ones that get to observe the determined out, like playing out of reality.
Is that another way of saying we are free when we identify with the collective, but we are not free when we identify with the individual?
Yeah, I think so.
Which is beautiful, because unity is built in, that means. Just like how when we destroy a certain species within an ecosystem, other species higher up in the food chain suffer.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden that their food source, or the food source of their food, is gone. So then the food that they're used to eating will also eventually starve and die. So then this layer that's 2, 3 levels, 4 levels above the extinct layer of the food chain are going to suffer as well.
Yeah.
So collectively, as a system, all layers matter, and we need to see all these systems within our reality as important and part of us, part of our environment, so that the whole of Mother Earth as a system can thrive.
Right.
And going even beyond the Earth, I don't know what the universal consciousness honestly desires or what its overall nature is, but the best way that we can learn about it is through our own planet and through our own selves, and going within and experiencing the deepest parts of us as an inner world, and the most collective parts that we have access to, which is our planet. Well, we have access to even further out levels, but
ultimately to let nature move through you.
Let nature move through you and identify as being one with all of nature, from the microcosm to the macrocosm, and not just this individual, egoic, selfish individual.
Yeah. So I think that answers the meaning question, because I mean we've explicitly stated where the meaning comes in then, but just to reiterate.
Where does the meaning come in short?
In short, the meaning comes in that we are the perceiver of the playing out of the universe. Without us, there would be no experiential state or observer of what's going on. So we're at the forefront of this computationally irreducible process that's going on. We are basically like the investigators of God or of the creator or whatever.
Investigators of this reality.
Investigators of this reality, exactly. So like we are the experiential mode for whatever is happening to learn about itself or to experience itself.
That sentence alone gives us all meaning.
That's pure meaning right there, yeah. Even if it's determined, that's the thing. Even if it's determined, it's not predetermined. So the final state is not known yet. The universe is determined,
but because
as
there's
it
so
goes.
many, and because there's so many moving parts, it could not ever possibly be predetermined.
Exactly. It has to play itself out, and we are the ones on the forefront of that.
Yes, and even if it was possible, let's say God is omnipotent, it wouldn't want to know because surprise is always better. There's a reason why we all intrinsically feel that a new movie is best to see the first time, because there's that surprise factor in it. And if we're all one with nature, then obviously the entity that programmed this motherfucker feels the same way. Surprise is innately amongst all beings the preferred way of observation. Preferably happy surprises.
Hopefully.
But maybe that's...
Yeah, well, I mean, I wish that upon all our viewers, is that the
pleasant surprises across the board.
Yeah, exactly.
But the negative surprises make the eventual pleasant surprises that much better, because there's the contrast and you're able to determine what was unpreferred and what's preferred.
Man, some people just have it so rough though. Like I just wish those people the best. It's like,
me too.
Fuck. Yeah.
But deterministically, because of their past, because of their ancestors' past, it's just the program unfortunately playing out in a unideal way. Which should, in a fucked up way, add appreciation to your own life if it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Because it could be a lot worse. So, of course, we can do what we can to give people who are suffering our time or our resources in the form of money or donations, or just sending good vibes out to them, or a prayer. Which we could get into the science of prayers and how praying for a certain area has been known to reduce crime when you're praying in large numbers. I'm talking over 1,000 people praying for the same city.
Is that right?
And crime going down. Yeah, we'll get into the stats of that shit. But anyways, those good vibes going out there make a difference. Just like in the same way there are experiments where you tell one cup of water, I love you, I love you, I love you. You tell another cup of water, nothing. And you tell the third cup of water, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. Over the course of a month, the hatred cup will rot.
Rot.
Yeah, when you like freeze it.
Yeah.
It'll be like gross,
shitty,
brown, disgusting, like frozen shit. The one where you told it nothing will be just normal ice. And the one where you said I love you, I love you, I love you will be the most intricate frozen patterns, like snowflakes and fucking beautiful sacred geometry.
Really?
Yeah. We'll get into those experiments.
Let's do the experiment.
Yeah, let's do it. With our beers.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into let's just quickly go through these.
Let's go through these different
philosophers, and
people
then-
here that I said we were gonna get to,
and
just
then we'll
for
wrap
fun.
it up.
Let's not rush it though.
No.
So, starting with the free will versus determinism that Eckhart Tolle addressed. So he says, I'm paraphrasing for all these people, by the way, but Eckhart Tolle says, in the beginning of our lives, before we realize we're the observer of our thoughts and feelings, we are living out our biology because we're so deeply identified with our thoughts and feelings. Everything is predetermined by our biological programming up to this point in our lives, and it is responding to our biological environment automatically. So our biological programming of who we are is responding to our environment automatically.
Mm-hmm.
When we awaken to becoming self-aware, in other words, we are the observer of our thoughts and feelings now, then everything is still predetermined, except now, rather than being predetermined by our biological programming, it's predetermined by the universal consciousness, or God, that is within us, or that we're all part of. So now we're aligned with a higher dimensional consciousness that inspires our impulses, that we then act upon or observe. Even the choice to act or observe is decided by higher consciousness.
Yeah, that's in line with what we've been saying as well.
Yeah.
That's cool. Okay.
The next guy I wanted to talk about is Sam Harris, who has been pretty outspoken in terms of supporting determinism. Paraphrasing again, he says, everything is predetermined due to our biological programming and the biological environment we live in. There is no way to create our own thoughts, they just happen. And because of many factors within our our mental processing, we end up at some conclusion, like dominoes continuing to fall, or cellular automata states continuing to update. It's all just one big determined process with the illusion that we are calling the shots. Because of this determinism, we cannot blame people so much for the wrongdoings they commit because they're just the product of their DNA and their environment. In saying that, he believes we should still have a justice system that stands as a factor in a person's deterministic mental processing as to what will happen to me if I do this action. Although the final say, according to these deterministic believers, is not necessarily that a wrongdoing is a person's fault, rather it's the result of their biological programming and environment.
Yeah, so this is good. I wanted to mention, because we discussed meaning, and I think we resolved that satisfactorily, but we haven't gotten to the ethics and judicial aspect of it, which we
Not
mentioned,
really.
and that's what Sam's getting at there. So with our current metaphysics and philosophy of Western thought, and basically it's pinned on individual humans having free will, acting according to their volition. It is their fault that they behaved a certain way.
Shame on them, they say.
So that's the thing, is if a person behaves a certain way and commits a crime, the judicial system is currently in most Western countries set up in a way to get retribution or justice on that person for the act that they did. So it's attributing pure responsibility to them as an agent with free will for committing that crime. And that's not really sustainable, and it's not really the optimal way to deal with these scenarios. Like, like Sam was mentioning in an interview that we were just watching, if we just look at psychopathy, for instance, and look at a psychopath and say that person's evil, that person's just a bad seed, like not try to understand what caused them to behave a certain way, we will get retribution on them, we'll detain them, but then we won't be solving the root problem of what causes psychopathy. He gives a very blatant example where, for instance, let's say there's a pill that can cure psychopathy. In reality, it would very likely be quite different, but you could imagine like some deep learning AGI could like solve psychopathy in the future, and that could be like the cure. But for instance, like for now, let's just consider there's a pill. If you give that person the pill and they're no longer psychopathic, they would most likely like thank you for doing that. They'd be like, wow, I don't identify with that person that was behaving that way, and I can't believe I was doing that, but that's the way I was. Like my upbringing and my DNA, maybe it's a genetic thing, or like the traumas I faced in life like caused this psychopathy. So if we could like really understand what causes the psychopathy, we could actually begin to resolve it and not just attribute it to evil and get retribution on these people. So like there's real consequences for not just blindly assigning free will to everyone, but to really go beyond that and try to understand all the causal mechanisms that cause certain behaviors to occur. Like we already know that human behavior is quite predictable to a high level, just based on personality factors or certain personality disorders. Like there's diagnosed personality disorders, there's diagnosed conditions like schizophrenia or like other things that are already agreed upon that this person is not behaving like a individual that fits into society, and this person will very likely engage in behaviors that are related to crime, for instance, or that are dysfunctional in society. So not just blindly attributing evil to these people and getting retribution on them, but really trying to solve the problem and basically deter that from happening in the future. That's the real thing that we should be trying to resolve.
Yeah, man. So many times you hear so many people say, "Oh, how could they do that?"
Yeah.
But like they don't actually stop and think, "Okay, how? Like actually how did they get to a point of doing this crime?"
And not even that.
Look at their past. Look at their DNA. Look at their genetic history, like with their family.
Yeah, when a person says that, they're not saying how can they do that. There's really what they're saying deep down is, I could never see myself doing that, because they're not applying empathy.
No.
They're just mapping themselves on them and being like, I would never do that. How could they do that?
Yeah.
And they're not trying to understand, oh, maybe this person was like beat or raped as a child. Maybe this person didn't have parents growing up, or like was bullied, or all the infinite possible things that could cause them to go down certain paths.
That's right.
Or to have certain disorders of genetics or
that's right.
Whatever.
I always come, like, what really, really helped me stop judging people in life is I came to the realization that if I had their past and their brain, and maybe you can even extend it to their soul and their upbringing, I would be behaving in the exact same way. And unfortunately, not all people have come to that realization, because also their determinism in life didn't lead them to reaching that. So I was about to say, if that's you, fuck you. But I'm taking that back, because life just didn't.
Their life also has the same thing.
Yeah. Right. So I can't judge those people either.
Right. Yeah, we can't judge the people that are judging, because they didn't have the proper input from external factors to then change their behavior.
That's right.
So
not fuck you if that's been you, but I wonder what it is in your past that prevented you from being compassionate towards other people who seem like psychopaths or murderers or rapists or whatever. We all have that potential within us. It's called being human. We all have dark sides, and there's a lot of fucked up animalistic what's the word we were using in the bottom part of the instinctual impulses that human beings have, and it's not in alignment with the highest good, and it's not in alignment with running a good society, or in alignment with our spirit or universal consciousness. But it's part of the evolution of intelligence, and we need to give grace to people who are still going through those growing pains as we collectively uprise past those lower levels of existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also not even just animalistic being the most dangerous, but I would actually say that this like spiritual level is the most dangerous.
Whoa, that's cool. What a twist.
Not spiritual in the sense that we're like advocating for in this podcast, but in the way that like Jung uses like this like spiritual or like transcendent form. For instance, if you look at an extreme example of a cult, they are behaving for a common purpose
that they believe
that is
good.
beyond them, beyond the individual. It's something that they believe in. And it often turns out to be some devastating consequence as a result of this shared extreme belief in this, where, for instance, like
drink the Kool-Aid,
where it's literally you guys like killing yourselves in this cult, or it could be like causing harm to others for a shared common purpose. I think in the first episode of the podcast, I was like searching for a term that I couldn't find at the time, but it's called a golem. It's when a group or a culture, like a group of people, behave for a common purpose that itself is somewhat evil, but it's sort of thought of as, or it's like rationalized in a certain way by those people as being like a higher cause for them to pursue. Like you could look at the Nazis, for instance, where they had reasons to do what they did, and they rationalize it in certain ways, and they behave as a collective. No individual could carry out a genocide, but when you combine humans together into this shared purpose, it sort of transcends the individual freedoms, and then this thing sort of behaves as its own personal agent. Like obviously there are like figureheads for it, like Hitler and the generals and all this other things who were like really drinking the Kool-Aid with that movement. But then there's also the lower level like soldiers who, even if they didn't agree with these things, they were like, well, I have to carry out this genocide or my family will be killed or something. So it's like these forces like work through you and take over you. And that's more dangerous, I would say, than behaving like animals.
Does that lay on the spiritual level of the sandwich, though, or the volition level in the middle where it's ego-based? Ego's attempt at trying to reach for something higher, but it's not quite at the...
I'd say it's maybe an interface between the two, but ultimately the defining feature of this top layer is that it is its own thing that acts as if it has its own volition and acts through the agents underneath it. So that's like the daemon, like the force that has its own volition that acts through individuals.
So in Jung's model, are the daemons or like the entities part of the spirit level, or
yeah,
they are.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it might not be like the good spiritual, that like we would advocate for when we're talking about spirituality here, but it's like you can maybe get rid of the term spiritual and maybe call it like some transcendent, like not transcendent in a spiritual sense, but like it transcends the individual. It's more of like a collective phenomena, like an emergent thing.
It's unity, but in a dark way.
Yeah, you can think of it as like some hierarchical complexification of individual humans that then exerts top-down causation onto the humans. So it's like the flock and the birds, where the flock is now constraining the birds' behavior. The golem, or this evil shared cause, is exerting its will down through the components that build it up.
Right.
And it's often not centralized. I think there's some centralization within like figureheads like Hitler or something, but it does enact itself sort of naturally through the collection of its agents. I'm speaking in like lingo of the previous episode now.
It's interesting because even on a smaller scale level, I think some of us can relate to that. I'll just use the example from my childhood where us little boys, as like anywhere from age 6 to let's say 11, we would pick on the uglier quote unquote girls in our grade because we're a bunch of little egos coming together, and it was like the dark side of unity where we felt powerful or something or funny when we were feeling that we were above these girls.
Yeah,
and using that as our source of humor.
You know what's funny about those things as well is that there can be no solid ground, but it still supports itself through the mutual interaction.
That's right.
Of the things.
Because
like
all of us as individuals would never
all of you probably
say
felt
those
bad.
things. We would never say those things to those girls one-on-one. None of us.
No.
We were all
You guys were
nice
all
to
nice
them
to them,
individually.
Yeah.
But as a collective, all of a sudden we
You
entered this state of just fucking little assholes.
Well, it's like you
bullies.
thought your friend would like think you're cool for saying this, and he thought you would think he's cool for saying this.
Right.
But
So
really,
it creates this own entity that
Exactly,
none of us actually are as individuals.
Yeah. So that's a lot of human behavior manifests through that, like where collective will can exert itself, and maybe nobody really wants that to be the case, but that's sort of the will of the collective at that point.
Yeah. So
Can I? Okay, say something.
When a person has gone through something like that, where it's like that dark side of unity as a kid before you become mature and see how toxic that is. But if you don't have the awareness of how toxic that is, then that just continues to grow in response to something like Germany losing in the First World War and Hitler rallying the troops together to have a comeback. And in the name of this country and in the name of our pride and our freedom and all whatever he said.
Gas the Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's be the top dogs this time.
Yeah.
And like it becomes all of a sudden realistic and relatable when you compare it to how you were potentially.
Yeah, so I'll just tie it back down to the judicial system in Sam Harris and Bernardo, who we've been pulling from, and Schopenhauer and Jung. I mean, they all have definite differences, but I think there's some general agreement that this determinism is at play, and that free will and retribution in an ethical sense is the wrong model for a judicial system. So Bernardo was giving examples from Netherlands where retribution isn't the metric. Like they don't try to get back at the free agent that caused this harm, the punishment is inflicted upon the perpetrator based on it being a deterrent for future perpetrators. So this works in a deterministic model, because if all of the potential criminals, like, we don't even have to give them free will, they can just be deterministic agents, but they're getting input from the judicial system that, oh hey, if I commit a certain crime, I'll get this punishment and go to jail. So that's an input to them, and that influences the computation that goes on in their mind, which is deterministic, but it's dependent on external inputs. So this is fully consistent with a deterministic universe. So what you do with your judicial system is you create these deterrents, which is basically jail time. You could also inflict other punishment if that's not a good enough deterrent, but it's not punishment for the sake of retribution. It's punishment for the sake of acting as a deterrent for that specific perpetrator, but also for other perpetrators, to try to reduce crime in your society. The next level to it is to not just like willy-nilly let this person rot in jail, but maybe to reevaluate them after some certain time and see if they've truly processed what they did, and if they are able to recognize that it was wrong and that they will not do it again. So getting them evaluated by a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist can essentially analyze whether that person has truly changed or not, and if not, then they can go back to jail, or if so, then you can try to reintegrate that person into society, and so on. This is all in alignment with the fact that this person didn't choose their childhood. They didn't choose all the events that happened to them. So it's not like they are an evil person per se. It's like all these events happened to them, and the event of them going to jail is another event that happened to them. And people can change. Like, it's not like you're set in stone and that this person will always be evil and commit crimes again. It's like a psychiatrist can hopefully analyze this person, and you can have social programs in place to reintegrate these people into society. It's like such a travesty what people do, or what the judicial system does to people in the States, is like, even if these people fundamentally change, they're just like thrown off the deep end once they get back into society, and they don't know how the fuck to manage themselves in a world that's like, let's say you get thrown into jail in the year 2000 and you're put out in 2010. It's like there's phones everywhere. There's like, it's a digital world now. Like, you don't know what the fuck the world is. Like, you're most likely just going to commit crime again. Like, you need to have some reintegration. You need to be treated as almost like a deterministic agent. Like, that you weren't responsible for your past. You have the ability to change if we give you enough inputs and support, and now we can let you be a productive member of society and have a meaningful life free of crime.
Absolutely. It's very good to bring that up, because with the belief of free will, and we all have complete agency over our thoughts, words, and actions, that comes with a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And when we make the wrong ones that don't serve society and we hurt other people, that's a lot of onus on ourselves, and not enough onus on the factors that led up to us choosing that.
Yeah, exactly. Or if like you're a failure in life, it's like, I'm just a failure. Like, that's who I am. Like,
and then you see through that framework and start acting only out of that framework.
Yeah.
And it's self-destructive.
Yeah. It doesn't let you see the full picture of like, oh, maybe this is why I'm like acting like a failure, but I'm not fundamentally a failure. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And maybe that requires external input for you to initiate those thought loops to like self-analyze yourself.
Yeah.
But hopefully you can arrive at that on your own.
Yeah, that's right. So,
Let's try to wrap up soon, I think.
well, no, we don't have to rush this. It's less than 4 hours. We're staying true to what we said.
Jeez.
Moving on to Neil Donald Walsh, who is the guy who channeled God through his writing and wrote the Conversations with God series, and what that series says about free will. And I'm bringing up this one next because it also says something about our judicial system that I want to get to. So hold that thought on our approach to the judicial system, because what we're currently doing is just not working, and it's not creating, like Jordan said, a proper integration back into society for people who come out of jail, or a proper understanding of even how those people ended up in jail. But what Neil Donald Walsh says in his book Conversations with God, so he's asking God about free will, and I'm paraphrasing, but the book says both determinism and free will are true. All possible moves that can ever be made are pre-programmed into the reality that we live in, like a video game. But ourselves, as conscious players in the game, get to choose which path to take. This somewhat seems like it goes against what we're saying with determinism, but so God, being channeled in the book, says, "This is our greatest gift, free will choice, and by possessing this power, we are made in the image of God. We get to create our own reality and our own life, although not everything. The main thing that we get to control is our emotional reaction to the many moving parts of our reality." The collective consciousness of humanity determines many of the events that unfold. So when we are constantly opposing one another and in a state of stress and hatred and violence, that manifests collectively in war, or potentially, even if we're so intimately connected to nature, more natural disasters. It's like the planet is responding to our consciousness as well. The book also says our souls decide what lessons they want to learn and what experiences they want to have in this life. Then they incarnate to go out and play them out. Sometimes our ego resists these intentions and does not learn the lessons that our souls intended, which is fine by our souls, because they know they'll just incarnate again and try again with a new set of genetic material. God has zero preference in this matter and has no agenda whatsoever. It's just happy to see its children playing in the environment that it created. Just like a parent watching their kids is happy to see their kid playing in the backyard. That's essentially what Conversations with God is saying in terms of free will and how this is all set up. Some of that applies to what we were discussing earlier, some doesn't. But going back to the judicial system and what this book says about how to treat criminals, it said the top way that we can prevent criminals from repeating crimes, or that we can prevent one another from committing crimes proactively, is by creating understanding with those individuals who committed the crimes and ask them about their past. Why did they do that? Why did they have this outlook on life? How did they develop that mindset? And then reverse engineer how to not do that again and repeat that. It seems so simple, but we don't do that enough.
Yeah.
the whole judicial system seems to be so reactive and focused on getting revenge for the wrongdoings of people and the misuse of free will that we're missing the emphasis that it should be, which is creating understanding and compassion and giving these people a real chance to be reintegrated into the real world when they get out of jail, and having the proper programs in place where they can learn how to either meditate so they don't impulsively react with violence again, or different psychological tricks that they can have in their repertoire of tools that they can use mentally. Just new approaches to living life need to be learned for those with the mental capacity in jail that can learn them, and we have not done a good job as a society to give those people that. There are places in Europe that, I forget which country it is, but they send their fugitives to an island to essentially harvest crops and cook their own food and run their own little society, which gives them all a sense of productivity and purpose and meaning, because a lot of them don't have families or the right support system to have a community feeling, but they do on this island, which is under minimal support from their police or the people who work at the jail. I'll try and get more details on that, but that's one approach. The bottom line is we need to create more understanding with the consciousness of these people so that we can prevent people committing crimes again. Okay, I'm going to try and sum this all up now and tie it all in together, what we've been discussing here about free will and determinism. So, we're moving from individual ego consciousness to more of a spiritual or universal consciousness in what has been called a conscious evolution era, where we evolved in previous eras physically and culturally, but now it's time for our consciousness to catch up so we don't destroy ourselves. So in this era, we're moving from attempting to manifest the ego's will to becoming one with nature's will, or also known as the universal will. So in this sense, even though all of our thoughts, feelings, actions, and decision-making processes are determined, it's also true that they are all determined by the will of nature, the will of the universe. And since we are one with the universe, we do also have free will in this sense. So Schopenhauer was referring to the universal will, and I just in my head related that to what the Chinese call the Tao, which is also the way, and the way meaning the way of nature. And the closest thing that translates to is immensity. It's this immense will of nature that flows through all things. Lao Tzu wrote a book called the Tao Te Ching, which is a book of Taoism that roughly translates to the way of integrity. So integrity, if we're trying to live in the way of integrity or the way of the will of nature, it needs to not just be seen as living in accordance with our highest morals, but literally as a fully integrated person where all parts of us, our instinctual parts, our egoic parts, and our spiritual parts are combined into one self, and all these parts can live in harmony and be accepted by us rather than condemned. We don't want to condemn our instinctual parts because it is necessary to survive. We don't want to condemn our ego selves, because also it's there to help us survive and find meaning and help us feel that sense of self. But we also need to continue this evolution so that we can live in better harmony with one another and be acting more from the spiritual side. So all three are important. All need to be living in harmony with one another. And when we accept all these parts of ourselves, it allows us to accept these parts in other people when they're behaving more instinctually or egoic. Because we've accepted that in ourselves, we'll be able to more easily accept that in other people, creating a more understanding and unified humanity, and less of a judgy and retribution-filled society. When all parts of what nature has equipped us with, our instinct, our ego, and our spirit, are unified and integrated, we'll be more in the flow of life with nature. And this is more swimming downstream and allowing us to be in the flow of universal consciousness. So I wanted to wrap this up with what Wayne Dyer highlighted about the nursery rhyme, row, row, row your boat. I don't even know if it's actually a rhyme, but just the poem, row your boat. So if you actually stop to think about the lyrics of that, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. We want to go with the flow of life, is what Wayne is trying to highlight in this poem. We don't want to be going against the flow of life, against the universal will, which the ego tries to do. It tries to give us our own, usually selfish desires that we want to pursue for our own pleasure, but universal will means for the betterment of all, as not just humanity, but as all living beings, as universal creatures. And it's supposed to be done merrily. It's not supposed to be a struggle. So row, row your boat gently down the stream, not upstream. Merrily, 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 merrily. Life is but a dream. It's just a dream that we're living. It's not meant to be taken so seriously. This is a sliver of reality in this dimension that we're living, and it's meant to be experienced so that the universal consciousness can learn from it and be surprised alongside of us as we experience and continue to evolve. So in short, there's no free will versus determinism when you zoom out and realize that everything is being determined freely by the universal consciousness that we are all a part of. This has been Inner and Outer Worlds with Zach and Jordan, and we are peacing out. Love you guys.